Another night of studying the Word as we study from the book of Genesis. The Open Book is your weekly Bible study podcast from Rick Winter Ministries, where we study the scriptures from its Jewish roots, but you'll find that there are other cultures involved. The aim of the Open Book is to give you biblical truth. It is filtered or unfiltered. It's without creed or church doctrine. It's just the undiluted truth given to you. Thank you for joining me tonight for this program. Tonight we continue our study in the book of Genesis and we pick up at Genesis chapter 37. In the book of Genesis here we start to encounter, as I shared last week, as I wrapped up the narrative of on Dinah, a sad story that is, but as I shared last week, it's not something that I could have just passed or glossed over. I had to look at what happened to Dinah. But there was a common thread that whenever the narrative or the discourse is about to change to the other main character, because remember, the Bible is also a literature, there is what you call the genealogical break. And so you had it in chapter 36, the genealogy of Esau. Of course, you had the genealogy of Jacob, but primarily it focused on Esau. And if you go all the way back to Genesis chapter 5, you had the genealogy of the antediluvians. And in that passage, we were introduced to Noah, who would have been the next character. And then by the time we reached Genesis 10, we had another genealogical narrative, and we were then introduced to Abraham. Before Abraham died, we were again introduced to another genealogy of Abraham's sons. And then we had the main character, Jacob. This narrative would be intertwined with Jacob, and then after the death of of Isaac, you saw where Jacob came home to his father, and then at some point his father died, and then you had a genealogy introduction again. And so now we are about to enter, I guess, the last phase of the discourse in Genesis, and to me this is the longest discourse. Now we pick up at chapter 37. In Genesis 37 we read where that Jacob lived in the land where his father had resided, the land of Canaan. So he was now back home from Paddan Aram. As it says here, this is the account of Jacob when Joseph was 17 years old. He was tending the flock with his brothers, the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah, and they brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than his other sons, because Joseph had been born to him in his old age, so he made him a robe of many colors. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Then Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain in the field, and suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to mine." "Do you intend to reign over us?" his brothers asked. "Will you actually rule us?" So they hated him even more because of his dream and his statements. Then Joseph had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Look," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." He told his father and brothers, But his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream that you had? Will your mother, brothers, and I actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father loved him. But his father kept in mind what he had said. Some time later, Joseph's brother had gone to pasture their father's flocks near Shechem. Israel said to him, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flocks at Shechem? Get ready. I am sending them to you. I'm sending you to them." "I am ready," Joseph replied. Then Israel told him, "Go now and see how your brothers and the flocks are faring, and bring back word to me." So he sent so he sent Joseph he sent Joseph to look for his brothers. And I'll stop there a little. I'll stop there a little. No. So we are now introduced to Joseph. Uh, he was the second youngest son of Jacob, but the firstborn to Jacob's true love, Rachel. And I want us to bear this in mind. Now, the scripture introduced us to him, and he was the one who brought home word to his father as it relates to how his brothers were doing. And as a result of that, they hated him because, of course, he was giving report on them of what they were doing. Now, the scripture shares with us that Israel loved Joseph more than his other sons because he was born to him in his old age. And if you understand someone getting a child in his old age, and this may be somewhat similar to how Abraham loved Isaac. In addition to that, he gave him a robe of many colors. I want to say he gave him a coat of many colors. His brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, and so they hated him and they never really spoke a kind word to him. Now, according to Jewish tradition, and I've said it, that Joseph would have likely been the firstborn son of Jacob, but he was his 11th son. But he was the person who dominated the narrative. To begin with, though, Joseph had a key position in the family as a result of being the long-awaited first child of Jacob's love, the love of Jacob's life, Rachel. And his father seems to be showing him a considerable amount of favoritism by giving him a special coat. And this, of course, engenders jealousy from his brothers. It would be a mistake, though, to view their behavior simplistically as which is typical of a dysfunctional family. What is clear is that the Bible is showing us that even in this family, they had mistakes, they had jealousy, and they had conflicts. The scripture shares with us that Joseph is having dreams, and he also interprets those dreams. Although in this case, the scripture here in chapter 37 didn't say that he actually interpreted any of the dream. The thing about it is, I want to believe that his family understood them based on their reaction. The fact that we know the story of Joseph, we understand then that he had a special gift for dreams and visions. He is also able to interpret dreams and to interpret them accurately and prophetically. And so here he tells his brothers that one day they will bow down to him. And this indeed happened many years later. But to his brothers, his dreams appear to verge on being a megalomania. And since they know that they are the family that will build a nation that's supposed to change the world, they probably think he's endangering the whole future of the family. You see, all of them knew the family history. And I guess in each generation, there's one bad apple. First, there was Ishmael, now there's Esau, and I guess to them, Joseph was the bad apple. That is to them. Here's a couple of things though. In sharing the dream, you'd have heard me say that Joseph had the gift of vision, or dreams and vision. The thing about a vision is, and it's totally different from a dream. The thing about a vision is that one is experiencing, when one is having a vision, one is experiencing it's a revelation or the unveiling of something that will happen in the future. It's not if that thing will happen. It's not maybe it will happen. A vision is telling you that it will happen. So, what was happening there? God was pulling back the curtains of eternity and giving Joseph a glimpse of what he would become. The thing about it is that his family, his brothers, and his father also understood it. Hence, the father's response the second time about the dream, because here's what he said. He said, this is what this is what he said in the dream, and his father interpreted. It says Joseph had another dream and told it to his brothers. Look, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. His father and brothers, he told his father and brothers, but his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream that you have had? Will your mother, brothers, and I actually come and bow down to the ground before you? Jacob understood this. And to give you an example, let us go all the way to the last book in the Bible, Genesis chapter 12. In Genesis chapter 12, it reads, and a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed in the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. And she was pregnant, crying out in pain and agony of giving birth. For those of you who understand end time prophecy, this imagery in Revelation 12, particularly verse 1, where it says, realize a woman was clothed in the sun, moon, under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars. Now let's go back to Genesis. what were the elements of Genesis 37? What were the elements? I had another dream. And this time, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. The only difference, as it relates to not elements, but the major luminaries or lights, is that there are 12 stars. The sun represented Jacob, which is why I said, will your mother, brothers, and I actually come and bow down to the ground before you? The moon represented the mother, and the 11 stars represents the brothers. Put that all together, what do you get? The nation of Israel, which is what Genesis 12 verse 1 is saying. The sun, moon, 11 stars. Jacob, the mother, 12 stars. So this time Joseph would have been counted. The 12 stars are the 12 tribes. In verse 10 here, Jacob understood the dream. He interprets it on point. And so does the brothers. But what does it say? His father kept it in mind. At some point, the brothers went because they were shepherds. And you have to understand, when shepherds go out to the field to feed their flocks, they will spend days, sometimes weeks, they don't come home. The strange thing is that these guys went to Shechem. Remember, they had moved from Shechem, which was a place that they destroyed. And I guess the fear of God was still there, that they weren't afraid. To the point that Jacob wasn't afraid to send his favorite son to Shechem. But on his way, he didn't see his brothers. And the scripture says a man found him wandering in the field and asked him, what are you looking for? I'm looking for my brothers. Can you please tell me where they're pasturing? And the man responded that they moved from here. I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. So Joseph set out after his brothers and found them at Dothan. Now, on his way to his brothers, they saw him. And immediately they plotted to kill him. The question I have is, it's your brother. Why would you want to kill him? Maybe, as I said before, they thought he was a bad apple because they already understood that they are a family that will build a nation that is supposed to change the world. And so anything that they think would be endangering the family, they would want to get rid of it. So they contemplated killing him. But based on, they were convinced by Reuben, the firstborn, not to do so. He said, let us not take his life. Don't shed his blood. Throw him in this pit in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him. Reuben said this so that he could rescue Joseph and return him to his father. So they stripped him of the coat that he was wearing, and they threw him into a pit. Now the pit was empty and there is no water in it. Let's look at the coat. You realize earlier I said coat, because coat, here was given to Joseph. It was a coat of many colors. And the coat was, because it had many colors, it is symbolic of light. And on the spectrum of light, there are all colors, there are many colors. And light speaks of illumination and revelation. Remember I said he had the ability to of dreams and visions, to have them. And he's also able to interpret them. So the coat represented all these gifts that he had. The coat, therefore, says to his brothers what they were not and what Joseph was. So in stripping him of the coat, they thought that by stripping him of the coat, they were stripping him of his giftings. But unfortunately, don't realize that what we wear is not where our giftings lie. It is a gift from the Spirit. So they stripped him because the coat represented something that they were not, but it reminds them of who he was. And so in stripping him, they thought they got rid of it. They dropped him in a pit. And then scripture says that some Ishmaelites were coming from Gilead. These guys were spice traders, and they were on their way to Egypt. They took him from the pit and they sold him. Because this is what Judah said. What profit will we gain if we kill our brother? Cover up his blood. Let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and lay not a blood on him. For he's our brother, our old flesh. So they agreed. So when the Midianites traders passed by, his brothers pulled him out of the pit and sold him for 20 shekels of silver. And they took him to Egypt. You see, the pit is symbolic of something, death. The pit is also symbolic of being stripped. Of course, they stripped him of his coat. But Joseph was being stripped of, depending also on his own ability, or he was also being stripped of everything that he thought he knew. Because in going to Egypt, he had to start life all over again. In other words, he's starting from the bottom up. And so being taken from the pit, first being placed in the pit is like dying. And the strange thing, and I always would say this, that God is a God of humor, because he was sold to spice traders. In other words, it's like he was seasoned for his journey. The strange thing about this is, what were the Midianites or the Ishmaelites selling? They were selling spices, balms, and myrrhs. This was big business in Egypt, because when somebody dies, especially somebody that is great, they were mummified. They were wrapped in spices, balm, and myrrh, which preserved them. No, in being sold to all of this, like I said, it was like Joseph had died being placed in the pit. And so being sold to spice traders, remember what I said about what the whole embalming process is? It's to endure even in death. So Joseph endured, it was for him to endure the hardship that he was about to face. So they sold him, and the Ishmaelites took him to Egypt. In the meantime, after all that happened, they took the robe, they slaughtered a young goat, dipped it in its blood, and they sent the robe of many colors to their father and said to him, "We have found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe or not." Of course, when Jacob saw that, he was heartbroken. This was the love of his life, the closest thing to Rachel. And his words were like this: "I will go down to Sheol mourning for my son. I will die mourning from my son." Do you know how many mothers and fathers have died heartbroken because their child has not come home, or they have died, they didn't get closure? This was what was happening to Joseph or to Jacob, because the son he loved is gone. Now, when the Midianites got to Egypt, they sold Joseph to Potiphar, who was an officer of Pharaoh, and he was the captain of the guard. Before I go to chapter 38, I want to say this. Sometimes bad things happens to you. Sometimes you don't know why the road that you're taking takes that turn. Trust God. Our fears, they have robbed us many times. Yes, our fears robbed us many, many times. Now, Joseph was in a new place. But who was he sold to? Potiphar. Potiphar had a position, a high position in Egypt. And so God started to network Joseph already without him knowing it. And this is why you trust the process. It's a process that you're being taken through. So trust the process. Yes, it's painful. Yes, it's hard. Yes, it's challenging. But trust the process, because you will get through it. So now he was in the house of Potiphar. And Potiphar was the captain of the guard. This was someone that worked in the palace of Pharaoh. This was someone who was in charge of the security. He was a wealthy man. But before we go further, there's a couple things I want to think about. Joseph was now a slave. He was brought to a foreign country. Possibly doesn't even know the language. It was a new culture. He was just a teen. The possibility is When the Ishmaelites took him to Egypt, they took him to the slave market based on the culture. And the possibility is that he may have been one of those who were first bought. And there may have been a bidding war because of his structure. And I'd want to believe he was well built based on his encounter with Mrs. Potiphar and what she said. Well, what the scripture says about Joseph, that he was handsome. He was good to look upon. And I just want to add this. I have read the Quran, a portion of the Quran talking about Joseph and his encounter with Mrs. Potiphar. And if you ever watch the movie Fatal Attraction, she was totally obsessed with Joseph because she has never seen anyone like him. To her, he was an angel. But let's get back. So the possibility was that he was taken to the slave market where he was sold. It could have been a bidding war. The possibility is that he was the first to be bought. Also, it may be that he was the last person to be bought. If you if you understand anything about a teenager, a lot of times we are not. When I was a teenager, I was never a bulky person. I was skinny. In Jamaica, we would say maga boy. If I weighed as much as a bag of cement, then I weighed enough. So the possibility he was slender, he was skinny, and it could mean that a lot of people rejected him. But Potiphar, and probably he was sold, or he was just given away because they just didn't want to be burdened with him, because these were traders. These were men of commerce, the Ishmaelites. So they didn't want to be going back with any goods. They came to Egypt to sell what they had. But nonetheless, whatever way it went, Joseph ended up in Potiphar's house. Now we go to Genesis 38, because the narrative breaks, and now we start to hear about Judah, Jacob's fourth son. Before we go there, let us continue our talk about Joseph. So he became a slave in the household of Potiphar. Where Joseph went in this foreign country, it was Egypt. Egypt was the second greatest, or the second of the two great civilizations in existence. Like now, many people want to go to live in America because it's the land of the free, the home of the brave. It's the land of opportunity. And people from all over the world have migrated to the United States of America. And their aim is to live the American dream. Egypt, in history, was just like that. It was the second of the two great civilizations of that time in existence. The first was the Mesopotamian civilization. And this was the Mesopotamian civilization was centuries before the rise of the Egyptian civilization. As a foreign country, Egypt was mostly deserted. It's mostly desert, except for the Nile River. The Nile is one of the greatest rivers in the world. If it didn't flow through the land of Egypt, the country would just be sand. So, guess what? Only 3% of Egypt was inhabitable and arable. I want us to remember this because Genesis 38 will take a break from the narrative of Joseph. And we're going to talk about Judah and possibly and Genesis 39. But I want us to remember this, although when I resume our conversation on Joseph, I'm sure I will return to this particular discussion. But so Egypt at the time was only 3% of Egypt was inhabitable, or it was arable land. This huge desert was a great natural defensive barrier, making Egypt totally isolated and virtually impossible to invade. This was the place that Joseph went to live. And we will come back to this because of the things that he did while he was in Egypt. Now to Genesis 38 we pick up, because if you realize, we, like I said at the beginning of this program, although it is the Bible or scriptures, which is my preferred term, we also have to remember that this is literature. We could have gotten the history of all of the sons of Joseph, but like in most literature, the main character, this is what is are the persons that gets the limelight. So we just spoke about Joseph, but now we're going to speak of Judah. Scripture says about that time, Judah left his brothers and settled near a man named Hira, an Adulamite or Adulamite. There Judah saw the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua, and he took her as a wife and slept with her. She conceived and gave birth to a son, and Judah named him Her. Again, she conceived and gave birth to another son. She named him Onan. Then she gave birth to another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kizeb that she gave birth to him. Now Judah acquired a wife for her his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But her, Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, sleep with your brother's wife, perform your duty as her brother-in-law, and raise up offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the offspring would not belong to him, so whenever he would sleep with her or with his brother's wife, he would spill his seed on the ground, so that he would not produce offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, so he put Onan to death as well. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, live as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought, he may die too like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had finished mourning, he and his friend Hira, the Adulamite, went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear sheep, she removed her widow's garments, covered her face with a veil to disguise herself, and sat at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the way to Timnah. For she saw that although Shelah had grown up, she had not been given to him as a wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute because she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter in law, he went over to her and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." "What will you give me for sleeping with you?" she inquired. "I will send you a young goat from my flock," he answered. But she replied, "Only if you leave me something as a pledge until you send it." "What pledge should I give you?" he asked. She answered, "Your seal and your cord and the staff in your hand." So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. When Tamar got up and departed, and she removed her veil, put on her widow's garments again. Now when Judah sent his friend Ira the Adullamite with the young goat to collect the items he had left with the woman, he could not find her. He asked the men of that place, "Where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim?" "No shrine prostitute has been here," they answered. So Ira returned to Judah and said, "I could not find her." Furthermore, the men of that place said, "No shrine prostitute has been here." "Let her keep the items," Judah replied. "Otherwise we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but could not find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has prostituted herself, and now she's pregnant." "Bring her out," Judah replied. "Let her be burnt to death." As she was being brought out, Tamar sent a message to her father-in-law. "I am pregnant by the man to whom these items belong." She added, "Please examine them. Whose seal and cord and staff are these?" Judah recognized the items and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not have relations with her again." When the time came for Tamar to give birth, there were twins in her womb, and as she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand. So the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it around his wrist. "This one came out first," she announced. But when he pulled his hand back and his brother came out, she said, "You have broken out first." So he was named Perez. Then his brother came out with a scarlet thread around his wrist, and he was named Zerah. So the narrative switches to Judah. And what an interesting story it is as it relates to Judah. Hmm. As Jewish scholars would say, an interesting thing happens in the Bible right in the middle of the Joseph story. The story stops. We leave off Joseph and we return to Canaan to pick up the story of Judah. Of course, he's the fourth oldest of the brothers, and he was a natural leader in the family. I could say that it's not immediately clear why we would need to be informed of this slice out of Judah's life at this point in the narrative, but it was important as it relates to the genealogy or the lineage of the Messiah in future episodes. So we learn that Judah took a wife who bears him 3 sons. The oldest got married to Tamar, but he died. And according to Jewish law, though the Jewish law wasn't implemented yet until a good 400 years later, or 300, um, the idea was there. But in the Jewish law, there's a concept called yibum, that if a man dies childless, It is a commandment that his brother should marry the widow so that she can have children and perpetuate his name. Accordingly, the second son married Tamar, but he also died. So Tamar was in line to marry the third son, but Judah was afraid, and so he stalled, in that he was afraid that the same fate would take his youngest son. So, in realizing that Judah would not honor the law and that she was growing older and childless, Tamar decided to take matters in her own hands. The Bible states that she disguises herself as a prostitute and waits until Judah passed by. She knew of Judah. She knew Judah was married and his wife died, and I guess in a state of mourning that he would have had needs. And of course, his wife died. Mourning was over. He would have had certain needs. So she waited on him, and he promised her a goat in payment for her service. But she held out for his staff and seal and cord as a collateral. As a pledge for the goat. Now, when Judah was finished, went to the sheep shearers and was getting back, there was no prostitute to be found. It is interesting that the scripture says he asked for the shrine prostitute or the temple prostitute. It is interesting. Why? It is, we continue to see the culture of the Bible playing out before our eyes. Shrine prostitutes. These were the things that were happening as it relates to idol worship. They were temple prostitutes, temple virgins. And this was one of the reasons the Lord had said to the Israelites in Exodus, between verses chapter 26 to 28, that they shouldn't ask the people how they worship their God, because it would be a snare. Judah would later hear that Tamar was pregnant and that he called out that she should be sentenced to death. But despite her situation, she does not embarrass Judah by revealing that he is the father of her unborn child. Instead, she sent the staff and seal with the request, "Please recognize whom these belong to." These were the very words that Judah had spoken to his father when, after having sold Joseph into slavery, he and his brothers took Joseph's coat and smeared it with the blood of a goat. They had claimed at the time that Joseph must have been devoured by wild animals. Through this parallel language, Judah is given, let me repeat, through this parallel language, Judah is given a hint from above that his leading role in the sale of his brother was a terrible mistake. He, however, confessed that Tamar was more righteous than he was. The thing about it is, he was able to stand up to his faults. He admitted to his own errors and ways. And before we close tonight, a couple things, a couple P2P points to ponder. What are you gifted with? What kind of gifts have you received from the Lord? Are you being challenged or are you being opposed? If you are, Why worry? It means that you're bearing fruit. And based on the culture that I'm from, Jamaica, no one stones or throws stones at a tree if it doesn't have fruits. So if you're being opposed, as Joseph was, welcome to the club. The second thing is that there are times we don't understand what the Lord is doing. Life sometimes turns, takes us down some roads that we really don't understand. Sometimes we're almost at the point of breaking. Sometimes we're at the point where we are really confused, but trust the process. Remember, a trial is never there to destroy you, but it's there to make you stronger. Joseph didn't understand that yet, but trust the process. Sometimes God reveals some things to you, i.e., Joseph's dreams. It was an unveiling of what he would become. Sometimes the process is long, but can you wait the process? Jesus said in Matthew 24, "He that endures to the end shall be saved." Your faithfulness is being built, which is a fruit of the Spirit. Perseverance or long suffering is being built in you. I want to close with this simple analogy. A pastor employed an architect to build a 30,000 seating or seater dome. A few days later, he called the architect and he said, "Make it a 36-seater dome." The architect had to go back to the drawing board and recalculate because he has to think about safety and that the structures, the pillars, they are firm enough to hold that extra 6,000 seats. He was surprised because he was finished, and so he had to go back to the drawing board. The God that created you, he's not surprised about the pressure that you're under. You know why? Because he built you with that capacity not to wilt or to be crushed or to be perplexed or to be destroyed under that pressure. Like Joseph, life sometimes throw you in a pit. Life sometimes send you along a road that you didn't plan to go. But it is that road that leads you into purpose. And those are my P2P points to ponder. I'm Pastor Rick Winter, and thank you for joining me tonight on The Open Book. The Open Book is your weekly Bible study podcast right here on my YouTube channel, Rick Winter Ministry. Comes 8:30 every Thursday night, and there are previous episodes that you can go back and watch if you are watching for the first time. Thank you for joining me tonight, and join me on Sunday for my other program, Deciphering the End Times, as we continue to look on the time of the end. Thank you for joining me. Have yourselves a wonderful rest of the night, and God's willing, have a great day tomorrow. Bless you.